world. I'm Missy, the Time Machine teacher, and today we're going to be talking about Unit 8 of the AP World History curriculum. Grab your notebooks, let's get started. Let's rewind first and talk about the context of Unit 8. And for that, we need to look at the end of World War II. World War II ends first in Europe, and there are a couple of conferences held. The first one is the Tehran Conference. That's between the three big powers, Great Britain, the US, and the Soviet Union. And they meet to discuss what will happen next. The Soviet Union is going to get land from Poland and Eastern Europe. And Great Britain and the United States will take responsibility for Western Europe. There's another conference that happens called the Yalta Conference. In that conference, President Roosevelt has some requests of Stalin. He wants there to be free democratic elections in all of Eastern Europe, and he also wants the Soviets to join them in the war against Japan. Stalin wants Eastern Europe as sort of a buffer zone so that he doesn't get invaded from the West, and he agrees to help with Japan in return for some territory in Asia. Another conference between the world powers is the Potsdam Conference. In that conference, Truman is now president, and he asked Stalin to give free democratic elections to Eastern Europe, but Stalin refuses. These conferences failed to come to any conclusions or agreements between the two world powers, US and the Soviet Union, and this sets the stage for the Cold War. Keep in mind that when World War II ends, a lot of Europe and Asia were destroyed and needed to be rebuilt. The US suffers the least in World War II because it didn't really incur that much infrastructure damage. It also had less loss of life. Both of these things allow them to help Europe going forward with a plan called the Marshall Plan. That is where they promise money to help finance the rebuilding of Europe. The other issue in the 1950s was that both the US and the Soviet Union had hydrogen bombs. This bomb was more powerful than the atomic bomb, and thus the arms race begins. The US versus the Soviet Union. During the Cold War, there was a lot of propaganda and secret operations and dislike for communists, dislike for capitalists as well, and just this general mistrust of both sides. There are also tensions because of the breakup of huge empires, such as the Austro-Hungary Empire that's broken up after World War II, as well as the Ottoman Empire that had broken up after World War I. Movements within these areas lead to the want of self-determination. That's where countries want to rule themselves, as well as self-determination movements in colonial empires. And by that time, most of Europe was too weak to hold on to their colonies anyway. Most of the colonized world either wanted total independence or, at the very least, self-government. If you're following along in your AMSCO book, we're now going to talk about Unit 8.5 and 8.6, in which we find some successful movements for independence. Starting off with India and Pakistan. In the 19th century, civil disobedience movements led by Gandhi, as well as the Indian National Congress, which was established to get the grievances of the Indians to the British, lead towards Indian independence. The Hindus worked together with the Muslims in order to accomplish this. There was a revolt in 1946, and the British realized they could no longer hold on to India. The problem was that the Muslims feared that the Hindus, because they were a majority, would take over the state and thus discriminate against the Muslims. So it was decided that India would be partitioned and become India and Pakistan. Both would receive their independence in 1947, creating a nation that would be predominantly Hindu and one that would be predominantly Muslim. Leading into the 1960s, women also gained some more power in South Asia. For example, Sri Lanka has a female prime minister by this time, followed by female leadership in India and Pakistan. Let's move on to some decolonization in Africa, starting with Ghana. They're the first African state to gain their independence from Britain in 1957. Their president, Kwame Nkrumah, helps develop the country into having more independence, specifically through projects such as hydroelectric plants. Some accuse him of corruption and getting the country further in debt, and by 1964 he declares himself dictator and the state becomes a one-party state. He was a believer in Pan-Africanism, and starts an organization in hopes of gaining African unity. But 3 years later, he's ousted by a military coup. And unfortunately for the people of Ghana, there wouldn't be a peaceful transition of power until the 2000s. Let's move on now to Algeria, where political protests lead to violence, and the French government responds with harsh laws and more violence to put down the protesters. At this time, many believe in nationalism and they want to fight for independence. So in 1954, the Algerian War of Independence starts. The French government really didn't want to give up the area, though, because French settlers lived there as well. So the French sent in troops to fight the National Liberation Front, who were the guerrilla troops who were fighting there for Algeria. There were violent battles in the streets, which led to many civilian deaths. And this fight will actually spread to France because the Communist Party there in France was really in favor of Algerian independence. Because it spreads to France, the president at the time decides to make a plan to move towards Algerian independence. After that independence was given, war breaks out again. Pro-French Algerians flee to France, which causes an influx of refugees into France and more problems there for that country. At that time, because of the housing crisis and the high unemployment for refugees coming in, there was a huge push for anti-immigrant sentiment among the French people. The first president of Algeria was overthrown, and the National Liberation Front takes power, collectivizing agriculture there in Algeria. And in 1991, the Algerian Civil War breaks out. This was caused by a one-party rule. The National Liberation Front holds the power, and they put out a national state of emergency that lasts until 2011. Despite all of this, there are still protests in Algeria today. I will link some recent articles down in the description below of what's going on in 2021 in Algeria. You can see that imperialism is still affecting that nation even today. Moving now to West Africa, which includes Senegal, the Ivory Coast, Niger, Upper Volta, and other territories. Here, the French used indirect rule through local chiefs. They invested a lot in infrastructure there, especially the railroad, and by 1959, those areas had independence. Moving on now to South Asia and Vietnam. The French ruled in Vietnam until after World War II, and then after World War II, they took over the southern portion of Vietnam. The communist leader in the north, Ho Chi Minh, tried to unite the country, or wanted to unite the country, under communism. The French, however, didn't want to give up their power, and this starts another war. It ended in 1954, and Vietnam was split between the North and the South. They planned to run an election, but South Vietnam was worried that the North would take over and force them all to become communist, and the U.S. supported South Vietnam. No election ended up being held. Instead, war broke out again. This war was fought between the North and the South. The U.S. supported the South because of the idea of containment and not wanting communists to spread. This is an idea that is kind of an overlay of the Cold War period. The Viet Cong were guerrilla warfare troops that fought against the U.S., and there was a huge anti-war movement in the U.S. that spread across college campuses. The war was very much disliked by United States citizens. U.S. troops were taken out from 1971 to 1975, and communists gained control. It resulted in 1 to 2 million deaths and caused more problems in Southeast Asia as communism spread to Cambodia and Laos. By the 1980s, some reforms happened, and the U.S. once again started to trade with Vietnam, which gives the economy a little bit more stability. When communism spreads to Cambodia, a guerrilla group called Khmer Rouge, led by Pol Pot, takes over. He started a cultural revolution to target the people against him, but ends up targeting a huge part of the population. Under his leadership and trying to switch the country over to communism, millions died and most were buried in mass graves throughout the country. In 1977, Vietnamese troops invade. They took over the country and Cambodia regained some stability. In 1991, elections were held and the nation became a constitutional monarchy. Moving back to Africa, Northern Africa to be specific, Egypt gains independence in 1922. Remember, they had been a part of the Ottoman Empire. However, the British will maintain some control there because of the Suez Canal. Whoever controlled the Suez Canal also controlled that waterway. So that's why it's politically and economically important. World War II is one of the founders of the Arab League, and in 1952, Nasser overthrows the king and starts the Republic of Egypt. He was a fan of Pan-Arabism, which means a united Arab world under the same culture. He begins to blend Islam with socialism and introduces land reform. He does this by changing private farms into collectives, as well as taking over some of the businesses. Then he tries to take over the Suez Canal. However, that didn't go so well. And this is called the Suez Crisis. The Suez Canal was built by Egyptian laborers, but it was funded by the French. Many Egyptians died in the process, but because the French had funded it, both parties felt as though they deserved rights to the Suez Canal. The British also wanted some control. In 1956, Nasser takes over the canal, and Israel is prompted by the British and the French to invade. Then the British and the French move in and occupy the area around the canal. The U.S. and the Soviet Union opposed this, and the UN helped come to a resolution. All troops were removed from the canal. It becomes an international waterway under Egypt's sovereignty. Britain, France, and Israel weren't too happy about the U.S. getting involved, but at least this one ended peacefully. Moving on now to Nigeria. In 1960, in Nigeria, a civil war breaks out between the Igbos, who are predominantly Christian, and the Muslim population in Nigeria. Because of imperialism, these tribes have been put in the same area, which is the conversation we talked about after the Berlin Conference, when the Europeans were forming territories that they weren't really paying attention to tribal lines. So this is in direct result to that. By the 1970s, the Igbos had failed to win the civil war, and most of the Igbo generals were granted amnesty, which means they were pardoned and not punished for their participation in the war. And the government was run by generals until 1999. At that time, new lines were drawn in hopes that it would create some unity when voting and elections were done. But there are still problems in the area today because of ethnic divisions, as well as the argument about who should have control of the oil wells presently in the country. Moving on to Angola. Angola fought for 14 years for independence from the Portuguese, and they finally win it in 1975. They also had the problem of several ethnic groups within their borders, and who would control the large diamond mines within the country. The problem was that each tribe was supported by a different superpower. So, after independence was granted by the Portuguese, a civil war breaks out and doesn't end until 2002, where they finally agree to a ceasefire, but there are still militant groups that cause some problems today. Moving on to Latin America, specifically Nicaragua, where war breaks out in 1979 called the Contra War. This is where a group called the Contra take over the dictatorship. That lasts for 2 years. The dictatorship is taken over by a rebel group, and then 2 years later, the Contra group comes in and takes over. War breaks out at that time and continues from 1981 to 1988. The U.S. backs the Contras, and the war ends in 1989 when both the armies are demobilized. Let's talk about Israel now. We know after World War I, the Balfour Declaration is established that gives Jews a homeland in the Palestinian area. After World War II, the push for that is even more because of the Holocaust and how many Jews died during that time frame. The world realizes that they need a homeland. At the time, the UN sets up sections for Palestinians and Jews, and they declare that area the nation of Israel. As you can imagine, the Arabs were not happy about this, and multiple wars break out between the Arabs and the Jews. 30 years of conflict will ensue between Israel and their Arab neighbors. Following the Suez Canal crisis that we talked about earlier, Israel and Egypt meet and have a treaty agreement called the Camp David Accords. However, many of the Arab nations refuse to recognize it. There are still problems in Israel today between the Palestinians and the Jews who live there, especially in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. That sums up decolonization and the problems that come along with it. So keep in mind, the whole time that decolonization is happening, the Cold War is kind of an umbrella over all of that. Rewinding just a little bit, let's talk about how the UN forms. After World War I, the League of Nations was formed to promote peace among the world, but it didn't really work. It didn't have enough power. It was very weak. So in 1945, the United Nations is founded. However, they couldn't stop the tensions and the Cold War ensues. Winston Churchill of Great Britain explains it as though an iron curtain was descending on Eastern Europe. The Iron Curtain is symbolic of the division between democratic Europe and communist Europe. It's symbolic of where democracy ends and communist begins. Kind of a division between the democratic countries and the communist countries. As we've talked about before, the differences between capitalism and communism are huge. At the beginning of the Cold War, the two major powers are the US and the USSR. The US is capitalist as far as their economy goes, and the USSR is communist. We know those two ideas don't go together. Capitalist is privately owned businesses and everyone looks out for themselves, whereas communism is government owned and everyone is supposed to be equal and things are supposed to be fair. Politically, the US and the Soviet Union were also different. The US was a democracy and the Soviet Union was more of a dictatorship. Elections didn't really count. The press was not free, it was run by the government, and a single party ran things. The other problem was that each side accused the other one of doing bad things for their people. For example, the US said that communists were taking away freedoms, and the Soviet Union said that the US was starving its poor people in the name of freedom. Also, both of them acted out of fear for the other. As we talked about earlier, both countries had hydrogen bombs. So this starts the arms race because now they have to make sure that they keep up with the other country. Whoever has the most military power will have the ultimate control. The Soviet Union gains Eastern Europe and forms what's called satellite countries. This is where these countries would be dependent on the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union would use their resources to bring back to their country. These countries in Eastern Europe include Bulgaria, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, and Romania. Stalin quickly changes these countries to communist countries, despite the fact that the United States asked him to allow for free and open elections there. He also uses them for the benefit of the Soviet Union. Soviets support revolution because they want the workers to revolt and turn to communism. They want communism to spread. The US, on the other hand, wants containment. They want to keep communism contained where it is and not allow it to spread. The Truman Doctrine was put out when Truman was president, and it was a speech about containing communism and his goal to do that. The US also wants to help through the Marshall Plan, which we've already discussed. There is some global resistance in Eastern Europe. They didn't just accept this overnight. For example, in 1956, the Polish workers protested. This eventually led to the end of collectivization of farming in Poland. In Hungary, a man by the name of Imre Nagy protested and tried to get free elections. Unfortunately, Soviet troops were sent in and he was executed. In 1968, a protest called Prague Spring happens in Czechoslovakia. A leader by the name of Alexander Dubček tries to get free press and more freedoms in general for the people. The Soviet Union quickly crushes this movement in hopes that it doesn't spread to the other Eastern European countries. There were also nonviolence movements during this time. We've discussed a little bit about Gandhi and his civil disobedience movements in India to try to get the British to give them independence, which will eventually result in independence in 1947. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. also fights for civil rights in the United States using civil disobedience, such as bus boycotts and marches. And Nelson Mandela fights apartheid in South Africa using civil disobedience. At first, his movements were a little violent, but later on in life, he moves more towards civil disobedience. And after he is released from prison, he becomes president and tries to move that country more towards unity. Also, in the year 1968, Yugoslavia, Poland, Northern Ireland, Brazil, France, and Japan, as well as the US, hold many protests to what's going on in the world, specifically on college campuses. The protests in the United States were as a result of the lack of support for the Vietnam War. And another part of the Cold War is the space race. As if they didn't have enough going on already, the US and the Soviet Union wanted to try to be the first in space. In 1957, the Soviet Union launches Sputnik, which was an artificial satellite that would orbit Earth, and the U.S. will launch one in 1958. At that point, the race was on to see who could get to the moon the fastest. The U.S. won that one in 1969 when Neil Armstrong was the first astronaut to walk on the moon. And as we've talked about already a little bit before, the arms race was also going on at this time. Both countries were testing out new weapons. The term used here is mutual assured destruction. That basically means that if one side has the weapon and the other side has it too, then if this side lets this weapon go against this one and this one launches that weapon, then at least they'll both be destroyed. It's not that one country has the power. The power is more balanced because neither country wants to be completely obliterated. In World War II, we see a lot of African and Asian colonies participating in the fight. But for the Cold War, they kind of wanted to stay out of it. And they start what's called a non-alignment movement. However, it didn't really work, and most Asian and African countries will align themselves with one of the two superpowers eventually. In Unit 8.3, the effects of the Cold War are discussed. One effect would be NATO. This forms in 1949, and it's Western countries who are forming for their defense and kind of forming alliances with each other that if need be, they'll go to war for the other countries. The Warsaw Pact is the Soviet response to NATO, and that's where the Soviet Union forms a pact with communist countries, or the Communist Bloc, as it's called. This includes Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, and Romania, and the Soviet Union, of course. Albania later leaves the bloc because it aligns itself with China. Yugoslavia doesn't join and eventually breaks apart due to ethnic divisions into smaller countries. There are two large proxy wars that happened during the Cold War. One is in Korea. For Korea, Soviets occupy North Korea, and the U.S. helps South Korea. In 1950, the North starts the war by invading South Korea in hopes of reuniting it under the communist powers. The UN votes to defend South Korea. Soviets will end up sending more money than actual troops to fight. The war ends in a stalemate, and the country is still divided today. If you haven't seen the documentary by Lisa Ling, it's called Inside North Korea, and I believe you can find it on Netflix. It's really interesting. She goes inside North Korea undercover. She's not supposed to be there. And I'm sure they were very upset by the documentary when it came out. But it's very interesting what's going on inside North Korea with communism there. If you get a chance, definitely check it out. And the Vietnam War we talked about a little earlier, that one was fought by the U.S. because they wanted to try to contain communism. As I said before, it wasn't popular in the U.S. and many protested it. In 1973, the U.S. withdrew from Vietnam, but violence continued until 1976. At that time, the country was unified, and by 1986, the economy did start to improve. Let's talk about Germany and the Cold War. After World War II, Germany is divided between France, Britain, the U.S., and the USSR. They also divide Berlin, which is the capital city, between the Allies and the USSR, or the Soviet Union. The Soviets are worried that the Allies will take over all of Berlin, so they blockade their side of Berlin to keep anyone moving across to the other side of Berlin. This also meant that supplies were not getting into Berlin. The Allies respond to this with the Berlin Airlift, where they drop supplies into Berlin to help the people there who are starving. After the blockade, Berlin is officially divided into the East and the West. The West would be the democratic side, and the East is the communist side. Eastern Berliners are seeing prosperity in Western Berlin, and many want to try to escape to Western Berlin. Also, some of their family was in Western Berlin, and so when this happened, families were divided. From 1949 to 1961, around 2.5 million Eastern Berliners escaped from the East to the West, despite there being a fence as a border. There are many stories about how people smuggled Eastern Berliners across the border into Western Berlin. For example, Volkswagens were very popular at the time in Germany, and they have a small area behind the back seat. It's not very big at all, but there were some people who would try to fit in that little space and cover it up in order to get across the border. In hopes of stopping this mass exodus, from 1961 to 1989, the Berlin Wall was built. dividing the two parts of Berlin. Finally, in 1989, it falls and Berlin is united once again. Moving on now to Cuba, communists under the leadership of Fidel Castro oust the government there and take over. At that time, he begins moving the country towards communism by taking over industries and businesses and turning them over to the government. The U.S. stops trading with them and Cuba becomes closely allied with the Soviet Union. President JFK is a little concerned about this because Cuba is very close to Florida and he's afraid that the Soviet Union will put missiles there, and that's what the Soviet Union does, is they start to arm Cuba, and JFK is worried that it may be a threat to the United States, specifically Florida. He decides to invade, and this is called the invasion of the Bay of Pigs. Unfortunately, it's a failure, and it results in Fidel Castro becoming closer allies with the Soviet Union. After Stalin, Khrushchev comes to power in the Soviet Union. He starts to ship missiles to Cuba to point them towards the U.S. His justification for this is that the U.S. has missiles in Turkey on the border with the Soviet Union. So he feels as though he has every right to do this. Of course, this is what JFK was worried about initially with the Bay of Pigs, and so he sends out the U.S. Navy to block the missiles from coming in. Fortunately, both leaders back down. Khrushchev takes the missiles back to the Soviet Union and agrees to not bring them to Cuba as long as the United States takes their missiles out of Turkey, which the United States agrees to. At that time, they form what's called the hotline, which is a direct communication phone line from the President of the United States to the leader of the Soviet Union in order to keep that line of communication open. There's also a nuclear test ban treaty that's signed at that time that outlaws testing nuclear weapons above ground, under the sea, or in space. Let's move on now to China, where Mao Zedong is in power and moves the country into communism. He starts with the Great Leap Forward. This is an attempt to move agriculture into communes and collectivize farming. He sends anyone who disagrees or protests to re-education camps. Unfortunately, it's a huge failure and around 20 million die of starvation. The plan was then abandoned, but Mao knew he was starting to lose power and that there were others encroaching on his position. So he starts what's called the Cultural Revolution in response to that in hopes of keeping his power. With the Cultural Revolution, he orders the Red Guard to seize government officials and take over. Many, including teachers, were sent to re-education camps during this time, and some were even killed. He puts out propaganda to get rid of the four olds: old ideas, old customs, old habits of mind, and old culture. These were said to have a capitalist leaning and needed to be removed to have a true communist society. If you get a chance, read a book called The Red Scarf Girl. This is a memoir of a girl who was young at the time of the Cultural Revolution and lived through it. It's really interesting to hear her tell her story of her experience and how she questioned this time frame, but eventually falls in line with it because she's a child and doesn't really understand the dangers that come along with the Cultural Revolution. Very interesting book. Check it out when you have the time. Moving on now to Iran, problems lead to a revolution in 1979. The Shah is ousted and Iran becomes a theocracy, which means that it's ruled by religion, specifically the Islamic religion. They oppose all Western policy and they oppose Israel as a state. Moving to Latin America, there's land reform going on. One example of that is in Venezuela, where they are redistributing the land, taking it from private landowners. Of course, the private landowners didn't like this, but they couldn't fight it at the time. Think of this time period as the Cold War as one big umbrella, and underneath that, all of this conflict that has to do with the end of imperialism and the end of World War II, as well as a struggle between the U.S., who are democratic, capitalist, and the Soviet Union, or the USSR, who are communist. And then as we move into the post-Cold War, we move into this time frame of terrorism that is seen throughout the world. One area is Northern Ireland, where there's conflict between the Catholics and the Protestants. There is violence in Spain, where the Basque region wants their independence from Spain. Violence in Peru from a group called the Shining Path, who gets their mentality from Mao and the Khmer Rouge. In 1980, the Shining Path overthrows the government there and changes the government to communism. There was violence in this group from the 80s all the way to 2011, when they finally admit defeat and they start to negotiate with the Peruvian government. Effects of that are still around today in the government and corruption there. Also during this time is Islamic terrorism in Africa, the Middle East, and the US. During the Cold War and near the end of it, there is also a response to military dictatorships. Franco is in charge of Spain until 1975, when he dies, and at that time they take advantage of that and they move towards a democracy. But during his rule, thousands died under his military dictatorship. There's a book called Fountains of Silence. It's historical fiction. However, it's based on actual events, and it's really interesting. That part of history, there were some events in there that actually took place that I didn't realize. So if you get a chance, check out that book. It's super great about that time frame. And there's a part in the very end that the author talks about how she found this information out and how she decided to write the book and bring this information to light. Also in the 70s, there's violence in Uganda. There's a dictator in charge there who's nicknamed the Butcher of Uganda because he's so horrible to his people. He denies basic rights and worsened ethnic tensions. He was responsible for around 500,000 deaths and also expelling Asians from the country entirely. When he threatens to attack Tanzania, Tanzanian troops come in and with help from the Uganda nationalists are able to defeat him and send him into exile. Also during the 70s into the 80s, the US and the Soviet Union enter this period called detente, which is kind of a thawing out of the Cold War. They sign what's called the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, which freezes the number of missiles that a nation is allowed to keep. The Soviet Union was also experiencing some challenges in the 60s and 70s that lead up to this thawing out period. They had massive food shortages and struggles with agriculture. Their trade was also very limited. Eastern Europe was protesting more and more, and there were skirmishes with China on the border. The US had some problems during this time as well. Their economy was suffering due to the Vietnam War. They did at one time send some grain to the Soviet Union. However, when the Soviet Union decided to invade Afghanistan, the US supported the Afghanistan rebels against the Soviet Union and stopped sending grain to the Soviet Union because of that. The Soviets couldn't defeat the Afghan fighters and end up withdrawing from Afghanistan. This puts even more stress on their economic system. After the war in Afghanistan, Gorbachev eventually comes to power in the Soviet Union, and he and President Reagan get along very well. Gorbachev also favors free enterprise and opening up the Soviet Union. The US and the Soviet Union signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which will restrict intermediate range nuclear weapons and cuts down on the tension. Amongst all of these world struggles, the Cold War slowly comes to the end with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. However, after the Cold War comes to an end, there are new challenges, such as changing political alliances, new democracies, inequality issues, global epidemics, and the fight for human rights. The world also becomes more interconnected through globalization. The UN definitely has its hands full in terms of trying to make our world a better place. And that wraps up Unit 8, all about the Cold War. If you have any questions, make sure and email me. And like always, if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure and do so and click that notification bell so that you don't miss a thing. Thank you so much for listening. I'll see you in Unit 9. They signed what's called the Strategic Arms Limitation. The war was very much disliked by the United States. At that point, the race was on to see who could get to the moon. In 1961, the invasion. And redistributing it.